Okay, so this will be the last video for this specific lecture on fairness and diversity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about affirmative action and diversity. And of course, this was an issue that had to come up, but I'm actually not going to talk too long about it. I'm going to link you guys in the description box below and also in the slides some other videos that will kind of discuss it more at length. Feel free to take a look at those. Um, so just kind of gonna give you a broad overview on what it is. Affirmative action programs, I'm sure you've all heard of them. They come from the fact that in the United States, all people are guaranteed equal opportunities. Well, theoretically in our Constitution, we're granted equal opportunity. In practice, it doesn't happen so much, of course, but that's, a long discussion I'm not really interested in really getting into here, but basically, equal opportunity but not equal outcomes is what we're trying to guarantee. And that goes back to what I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture with the difference between equity and equality. We're guaranteed equity, that equal opportunity. We're not guaranteed equality where everything's going to be the same for everyone. And affirmative action programs were programs that were designed specifically to reduce underrepresentation of specific demographics in the workforce. It was originally designed for work and employment to address an issue that was that people were not being treated equally. So essentially, like it was hoping to reduce discrepancies because of unfairness that existed in the past. However, there's a lot of controversy around these programs because people perceive them as more of an equality thing rather than an actual, merit equity thing. And a lot of people in a lot of different groups really just sees themselves as being at a disadvantage because of affirmative action programs. So kind of that idea of we swung too far in the other direction. However, I will say that most people don't really know what they consist of and what they mean and how they work. They just hear something or they heard something about them from someone else and believe it without really looking into all of the history of it, how it formed, how it's changed over time, how lawsuits for and against it have gone. So I encourage you to definitely watch the videos that describe it at length. They're more informative than even what I could tell you about it because I'm not the most familiar and understanding person about it. Plus, they're just really well done. So if you're interested in this topic, I really encourage you to open these links up and take a look at them and really try to formulate your own thoughts and feelings about them. It's definitely a good topic for discussion and debate. If you think that these programs should exist, if so, how and when and why, but it really covers their history, their formation, and what they've kind of become, which is honestly more in higher education than it is in employment. One thing I will say though is in the second, I believe, of these videos, the guy who talks about affirmative action, he makes a comment that I believe is actually historically inaccurate, and it's a little off topic, so this is kind of just a little aside. But he makes some comment about early on when the first African Americans come to the United States as slaves. That's not actually historically the truth, and it's something that I didn't realize, but the earliest Africans in the United States came over as indentured servants, which is slightly different from slavery. It's still not a lot better, but it's a situation where, for example, a lot of Irish immigrants were in this. They'll come in because they're poor and they will work in a person's household to pay off the debt to them that got them into the country. And once their debt is paid off, they're allowed to go live in their own estates, in their own homes, and build up their own lives. And we tend to believe, for some reason, that African Americans only originally came over as part of a slave trade, but actually there were a couple generations, we believe, of African families living in the United States who bought their way out of their indentured servitude and started really making a life for themselves. And that's, I think, interesting and important to recognize because if you want to talk about the history of race, it's just something that we don't want to ignore, that was happening. And then, try to imagine being one of those families and then slavery becomes a thing, and not only is it a thing, but it's also purely racially based, and that's the uniqueness of the American history, which gets us into these affirmative action programs. The fact that they exist is because although discrimination and bias and even slavery has existed in pretty much every society in history, the United States is the only one where it was entirely based on race and the color of your skin. Um, and so while we may not like that these programs are looking to kind of right a historical wrong, we have to recognize that that historical wrong is unique in, I don't want to say it's horribleness, because slavery is horrible in any form and it's always terrible, but the fact that it was based just on color, it does kind of make it uniquely horrible, because in every other culture it was based on class and wealth, right? It's, are you the lowest class, or you the lowest caste system? um, for example, one of the most historical hotspots of slavery was ancient Egypt, right? But in ancient Egypt, think about where Egypt's located, it's in Africa, but it's northeast, so you have the Middle East right there, you have Europe. They had a diverse population in terms of, color or ethnicity, and who was in charge and who was a slave had nothing to do with color, it had to do with money, and it had to do with power. So the history of the United States is unique in its racism. Yes, there's racism in every culture, but that being said, the fact that the United States had that unique racial element to discrimination and slavery in particular makes these affirmative action programs kind of make sense, and the fact that they're a very American thing to do. So, I encourage you for more on that to watch these videos. I know I got a little off topic, I guess, there, but definitely things to be thinking about and talking about. And, you know, we, as the videos themselves address, we haven't completely gotten to a place of equality yet. There still are disadvantaged groups, which are, you know, we could say it really boils down to they are a class issue, where there's people in more impoverished neighborhoods are struggling, but we also have to recognize that those people are largely minorities, or minorities are more at risk for being in those populations, and that's because of the history of racism against minorities. So, considering all of that, I want you guys to watch those videos, think about what's in them, think about what you think is going to happen with these programs, what you think should happen with these programs. Um, and if you are interested in discussing it, definitely post about that in our forums. This is definitely one of those topics that can lead to a lot of conversation. But I'm going to move on from the affirmative action stuff, and we will just finish up our lecture. So when it comes to diversity, I've talked about this one as well. There's different types of diversity, but diversity just talks about differences in characteristics. And there's two types that I mentioned previously: the surface level diversity, which is differences in things that you can see on the surface, they're observable, usually demographics, like age, gender, race, religion, and sometimes sexual orientation. You cannot tell a person's sexual orientation necessarily by how they look, of course. However, there are things that people use as indicators of that, and will make judgments, assuming those things about others that may or may not be true. But so sexual orientation could fall under a surface level issue. Probably I would put it there, mostly because when you go into deep level diversity, even though theoretically sexual orientation is not a physical characteristic, typically deep level diversity has to do with personality, values, beliefs, the way you think, those types of things. But you could also just say non-observable. And then we talk about this concept of relational demography, which is the relative makeup of various demographic characteristic and particular groups. So it's just the terminology for how diverse is your group. And then you want to ask the question of, is diversity good or bad? Most often it's viewed as a good thing, but the deep level diversity, and I think I've said this one before as well, can present some challenges in groups and teams if it's certain characteristics. Sometimes deep level diversity is good, especially if you're looking for innovation and you want to present different types of ideas, but it can also hinder progress when it comes to when it comes to things that, you don't want to get stuck on debating, right? And generally, there is evidence that diversity can be both good and bad, depending on a number of other circumstances. We definitely see the positives of having a variety of perspectives, but there's also a lot of positives to having kind of a unified way of doing things among your group. So why do people oppose diversity? Well, sometimes it's because of disagreements, like I just said. The teams that are too diverse just constantly arguing amongst themselves and being unproductive in their communication. And these are reasons that I would say is actually, kind of valid of opposition of diversity. We don't want our groups to get stuck not being productive with each other because they just don't get along. And there are invalid, I guess, biased reasons to oppose diversity, like just plain old discrimination. But in terms of actual reasons that I could say have merit, that's probably the main one. Um, but most successful organizations, they strive for diversity and also inclusion. So inclusion is not the same as diversity. Diversity is kind of just, are your people diverse? Inclusion is, does every different type of person among your group get to participate in the organization's activities and decisions and all of these things? So you want equality, not just in, oh, we have a bunch of different types of people, but also in all of our different varied group members are involved in the organization equally. And I think I can't remember quite which lecture, but I definitely discussed a little bit about the difference between, assimilation and other ways that diversity is approached. But assimilation is really quite unsuccessful. So if you're looking for a successful way to promote diversity, assimilation is bad. And assimilation just means everyone is basically forced to assimilate. And since we're going in our Star Trek example, like the Borg, where they all have a hive mind of robot, you know, interactions with each other's brains through technology, that's assimilation, right? You will be assimilated. It means you're gonna all think, act, and be the same way. And this definitely doesn't help, especially minority group members, because the majority group is gonna be the one whose ways of thinking and being are the norm, and then all the others have to um, assimilate into that way. So we don't want that. Another one is protection, or you might even consider this that the type where there's just like almost pockets of different groups that are separate from each other. So you're kind of identifying who's all the different groups and maybe even protecting or providing special treatment for groups that you think are minorities. So this Harriet and Pemberton's researchers, theorists, they advocate the use of a value model. I would also just call this plain inclusion, where you kind of have a recognition of people's differences, but valuing what is unique about them and what they bring to the organization. So don't try to pretend it's not there, but also don't emphasize it too much as if like we need to separate them and keep them protected. Just recognize that you have different perspectives in your organization and different cultures and different norms and different thoughts and feelings. But these differences can all bring something good into the organization. So typically when someone comes into an organization, they're socialized to adopt the organization's values, and that kind of is this assimilation feature. So you want your organization itself to have values that are not based on a single type of culture or race or something like that. You want, if you're going to develop an organizational culture, it should be based on the organization and its members and the uniqueness that each individual brings into it. So just, keeping in mind that diversity is not something we can ignore, but also not something that we want to either fight or emphasize too much, right? It's inevitable that there's going to be some subcultures and subgroups that come out of your organization. You're going to see some um, differences in teams and departments just because of the way organizations are structured naturally. But leaders of different groups should strive to create whatever subculture best fits with their group and specifically with their organizational culture, but also maintaining the inclusion of different members of the unit. So I'm just repeating myself at this point, but all it boils down to is just remember it's okay that you're different. Everybody brings something to the table, but I think it goes back to, and I do remember I discussed, Alport's ideal conditions, making sure that as a team, your group recognizes that even if they're different from each other, they have an overarching goal, which is they're working together for whatever the goal of the organization is. And that is pretty much the key to successful diversity, right? Um, so that concludes the topic of diversity. I have another video in here that you can watch if you'd like. It's from the original Star Trek series and it has to do with racism, but not necessary for the class. Just take a look if you're interested. And I will be back with videos on leadership. If you have any questions, send me a text or an email, and I will see you guys in the discussion forums as well. I'm gonna go look at those today and see what you've posted for the past few days. All right, I think that's all I have for you. Have a good week. I will see you in the next lecture.